We're just going to have a very small alliance building moment, or at least trust building. And then a second piece, just a little bit about mobile health and mental health, which you've already heard some about. So I'm going to skip through super fast. And then the rest of the talk is really about guidance in the form of either specific recommendations that I can give to you at the front end, or thank you, or hilarious ways in which I have had the great opportunity to screw up. And you all can benefit from those experiences because they are numerous. So this is my official fancy sounding position. I'm the National Director for Mobile Health for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, which is the largest integrated healthcare system in the country. I also, primarily for the past year, since I had my second and final baby, for sure, I have been concentrating on consulting, and so I have a consulting company that I use to consult to startups, to big pharma companies, and sort of everything in between, as academics as well. So that's just a little bit of backstory for you. We're going to skip forward. So the DoD and VA have very specific challenges. I was told by VA lawyers that I couldn't put any words on this screen, so let me just explain it. So we have a huge number of people who need services. We have their family members as well, and all of their dependents. If you have a military family especially, what you have is a whole system that is impacted by deployment, and we do not have enough care available to serve all of the people who have mental health needs. You may have seen that in the newspaper once or twice. Healthcare providers, as I say, that used to be me. I did used to clinically practice. That's me when someone else does my hair. Healthcare providers in our systems are incredibly swamped. They literally cannot provide all of the treatment that is needed. We have all kinds of controls on our system. We have the great opportunity to have a system that is basically a single payer system where, and we are completely divorced from all of the economics, the complexities of the economics of healthcare, which is an amazing position to be in when you are building innovative products. We have clinic staff limitations. So government hours are 8 to 4:30. Unfortunately, mental health hours are more like 24/7. So if you need to get an appointment and you're a recent returnee, a young veteran who has a family and probably a job, a civilian job or a military job, it's very hard to get to a clinic between 8 and 4:30. And then we also have our healthcare system. My apologies to Alaska. We also do serve Alaska. But we have a healthcare system that has all kinds of financial and other sort of pressures in order to provide optimal care in efficient ways. So we've got all of these pressures. I'm actually going to skip through this in the name of time, but let me give you the short version, which is that I was seeing my patients with PTSD, and they said to me, we just need something to use between sessions to help us with our acute distress. I said, well, you know, I've been working on a website for the Department of Defense for the past couple of years. We've spent about $100 million on it so far. It's congressionally mandated. Unfortunately, the whole thing was built in Flash. So this was in about 2008, 2009, when all of a sudden, everybody's holding iPhones that don't support Flash. So the ground had moved from beneath our feet. I pitched for some end-of-year money. Maybe not all of you are familiar with the pot of gold that is end-of-year money in the federal government. But if you wait until about, August, September, you can get a lot of cool things done. So I pitched, I got a total of $24,000 and built what became PTSD Coach. I showed it to somebody, they showed it to somebody else. We had no idea what we were going to do with it other than give it to my patients who had provided tons of feedback about what they actually wanted. On a day when Barack Obama happened to say to a White House staffer, you know what we need? Examples of innovation in federal government. And the staffer said, I just saw an app. So all hell broke loose because Barack Obama said, this is great, get this app into the market in 6 weeks so that I can announce it at my April 12th, 2011 press thing. Now, up until this point, the federal government had never actually published a mobile application. Any applications like IRS to Go, the one that tells you when your refund is coming if you're not like me and actually pay all the taxes you're supposed to up front. So all of those had been published by contractors because it's actually the terms that Apple had in their agreements were actually completely illegal for a federal entity to sign. So because I was 8 months pregnant, that helped, and was able to literally walk into Apple on my way home from work. I live in the Silicon Valley, and say, somebody's got to help me. Barack Obama said so. They did. We had many, many lawyers on the phone together, and ultimately hammered out the new agreement that became that created the possibility for federal entities to produce apps. And now there are many, many apps produced by the federal government. In the end, this is me losing it and us going over all the hurdles. In the end, Barack Obama did not announce it at that press conference because the federal government was shutting down because of budget issues. He had bigger fish to fry, but it was announced on the White House blog. And without that, who knows how many federal government apps we wouldn't have. PTSD Coach went on to be very successful. I think it's had 400,000 downloads at this point, which is no Angry Birds, but it's quite a lot for an intervention for a very specific purpose. It's been versioned by 12 different countries, 12 different languages, countries that came to us and said, our soldiers are saying that you guys have a thing that we should have. German police officers, domestic abuse patients in Kazakhstan, domestic abuse survivors, and it's been overall really well received. So without any marketing whatsoever. So from there, we started building a variety of products in the VA, a whole bunch of mobile products for aiding in self-management. So for people who have too much stigma or logistical concerns to actually make it to mental health care that they need. For enhancing clinical care, that picture is not a mistake. 90% of, just like in the rest of the United States, in the VA, 90% of mental health care occurs in primary care, which basically means you're going home with a script. If we can improve care by you're going home with a script and an app, you've already done something really, really meaningful. Even at a population health level, let's say the app only helps 1% of people, you get a big enough population, it makes a big difference. We can support families, it's scalable. We can enable healthcare providers to be following the protocols that they need to follow. We can support evidence-based psychotherapy. Psychologists will get my joke in the picture. Nobody. So we can support evidence-based psychotherapy. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And we can educate and train and increase efficiency. So things like scheduling with the healthcare system, tracking your symptoms over time and fulfilling all of your requirements. So I have a little bit of an identity crisis. My mentor and friend, Deborah Estrin, who was until not too long ago a computer science professor here and now is at Cornell Tech, referred to me helpfully, I think, as the API to her team. So now I just think of myself as an API, and it really clears things up for me, because what I do is have all of the language of all of the people that work for me and work with me. And in all of the different settings, so not all of these are applicable in different settings. For example, product marketing really only applies when I work with startups, versus in a pharma company, marketing is a pretty clearly defined and bounded thing that I cannot be involved with. In VA, we have no product marketing at all. We just use our top-down control to get clinicians to use all of our products in their best interest. But so we have we have partnerships. We have a regulatory that we need to deal with occasionally. I have students that are working on this stuff all the time. We're always working with end users, including front-end clinicians, teams of subject matter experts. If we want to build an app that's for cognitive processing therapy, we go and find the person who invented cognitive processing therapy, and we say, hey, Patty Rezick, come and help us build this app, and generally they will, because of our reach. We can and our overall control. Now, software engineers and testers in UI UX are green, because in VA because of the structure of VA, we are forced to contract those jobs out. We cannot have them working for me directly. But in any other environment, if you don't have to do that, if you can have people embedded with you, it makes a huge difference. So this is what I've been trying to do for the past bunch of years: refine a process for safe, appropriate, and effective development of technology-enhanced mental health care. all in the context of efficiency, because this can take forever. And in the federal government, nothing may go over a fiscal year. So that's as long as you've got. There are limits to Agile software development under certain conditions. People ask, sort of what's the process? This is excluding getting funded, evaluation, which happens throughout the entire process, implementation, which is super important, and I'll talk about in a minute, and sustainment. So this is just sort of chopped out of the middle of the process in order to show you just how do you actually build the thing? How do you actually build, in this case, an app? I'm talking about sensors. So from ideation, definition, this is the psychologist or subject matter expert heavy part, where you actually need to define what the thing is going to do and going to be, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Design, this is very artificially linear, as you can tell, because these things should be going together. Software development and testing, certification, any that you need, including FDA or any internal certifications. We have many in federal agencies. And then Apple and Google regulation, and then deployment. So all of these are steps that you'll need to go through. I think start to finish, your best case scenario is, well, actually I did one for a startup and it took 3 months. Never done that before. I think I will never do that again. But usually like 9 months is the minimum, and then 2 years is more the maximum. We have a whole research and evaluation arm. We have researchers and evaluators that work for me. So we look at usability and feasibility, validation of constructs and concepts, clinical outcomes, certainly. I mean, we would all love to see clinical outcomes, but you can't always get there first. And then implementation and dissemination variables. Okay, lessons from the trenches. So tracking and changing mental health status is actually hard. I have people come into my office in Menlo Park and pitch to me all the time. They're startups, Stanford grads or current Stanford students, or other kinds of like early stage startups. Everyone's talking about steps these days, but I'm really into breaths. And I look at people and I say, if you think that breathing, changing someone's breathing patterns is going to change actual mental health and mental health treatment of actual mental health patients, I have an internship for you, an unpaid internship, for you to sit and see what actual mental health patients require. You can help a healthy 30-year-old man, let's assume he's white because most of them are, with Fitbits in the picture of the Silicon Valley, but you probably can't help people with actual problems navigate an actual healthcare system. So you have to decide up front how realistic somebody's intervention really is. Can we help people with Fitbits and breathing things? Yes, sure. Mostly healthy people you can help. That's not what I usually am seeing. It doesn't really matter what size the organization you're working in is. As I say, VA is the biggest bureaucracy in the universe, down to the tiniest little startup. The problems you're going to have in building things are pretty predictable. Designing your intervention, the business needs, who are you actually serving, funding constraints, healthcare system complexities, clinical implementation, and ethics. So there's some issues that are very specific to mental health. Our gold standard measures are self-report. And so starting right there, we've got a problem when we are even if we can find objective measures, and certainly some of the stuff you've heard this week about how to actually look at objective measures of stress episodes, that kind of thing. These things are novel. We're still comparing them, and amazing. We're still comparing them to our good old-fashioned pencil and paper, which maybe takes place now on a mobile device, but it's still the same self-report mechanism that we've always used. Our mental status is continuous. It's not actually really categorical. So, if a person's mentally healthy, for them, what does that really mean? They're kind of at their base. I run a little anxious. I'm like kind of an anxious person at baseline. But that's just where I am. It's not actually troubling to me. It's not actually dysfunctional for me. It actually probably is functional for me. Anxiety at some level probably serves a function. So it's really tricky to know if we've actually fixed somebody. Unlike this is actually Lance Armstrong's broken shoulder. It's clear that it's broken, I would say. And I'm not a radiologist, but it's clear that that's a broken shoulder. And we could take additional images later to see whether or not it's, healed appropriately. We don't have that same kind of thing with mental health. even with related disorders like mild traumatic brain injuries, which are the signature wound of the current conflicts because of blast injuries. So a mild traumatic brain injury is just a concussion, a soldier word for a concussion. Most of them, the vast majority of mild traumatic brain injuries, you cannot see on any imaging. Now, new imaging is getting a little bit better, but so even there, we've got a physical problem that we can't see. Our gold standard interventions are complicated. They're hard to, I can't read that word, but they're only partially successful. Cognitive restructuring is at the core of many of our most effective interventions. For those of you who aren't psychologists or related, cognitive restructuring is I take a thought that is probably dysfunctional, that's probably based on a pattern that I use all the time, like my mom is being a jerk, and then I have to take apart that thought, and then I have to figure out, is that really accurate? Am I catastrophizing? Am I overgeneralizing? You look for patterns and then come up with a more reasonable thought or an alternative thought that you can then try and dig into. This is a very effective piece of many of our interventions. Unfortunately, it is super, super, super hard to do automatically. So where a lot of digital mental health interventions fall apart is with this cognitive restructuring piece. Because if I have a patient in front of me and he says, my mother's being a jerk, and I say, okay, so maybe that's the thought we should work on right now. He says, no, she's really a jerk. Now, I don't have necessarily that leverage if I'm not actually with the patient to be able to identify the right thing, to be able to help them take it apart, to be able to help them find some insight. This piece is still missing from most of our interventions. And so what you find are people working around the edges and instead providing small scale, kind of tailored micro interventions, like here's a prompting text message, here's a prompted video, here's various prompted things that are not actually walking the person through the process themselves, even though we know that going through that process and specifically doing it with information that is relevant to you specifically is the valuable part. So we're missing the whole thing here. Okay, so this is super quick, but there are a couple of things that I just want you to learn about. Implementation science. This is the for dummies version. So there are journals now. There are all kinds of available resources on implementation science. Implementation science it's a relatively new field. This is Fixin 2005, so it's kind of old, but it's still relevant. Implementation science is about understanding how new things are disseminated and what are the tricks of the trade to actually get new innovations disseminated. You should know design thinking. Just Google it. These guys are good about being online. If you haven't seen anything about design thinking, I wish for you that you will find yourself in a seminar about this, a multi-day seminar about this sometime soon. It's transformative. It's transformational. There are design thinking mindsets like radical collaboration, focusing on human values, being mindful of the process. All of these things are way more than I could actually express to you now. But as I say, you Google it. There's a design school at Stanford that really has an IDEO and a couple of other resources you can find to understand this better. I don't know what's happening. Okay, and then the last one that I really want you to know about, just as kind of a foundational thing, Diffusions of Innovation. Here's the book by Rogers. This is just a whole set of constructs for understanding how new ideas spread over communication channels over time, and just understanding how to codify each one of those things. We've used this over and over again in understanding why certain things get diffused into real use and why certain things fail to get diffused. It's an incredibly valuable but dense book. Okay, here's various realities and mistakes. Okay, user experience and interface mistakes, or how I gave up on being an expert and learned to do usability and acceptability testing. Form is function. I think you got some of this from our UX folks on Monday, Tuesday. The HCI, human-computer interaction literature, is very clear. You can't differentiate form from function. If something is ugly or unusable, you will not have positive outcomes. We as scientists, especially for those who are applied among us, people who are clinical in any way, believe that we know the best way to actually treat patients, and then we just try to replicate that. Well, this is evidence-based, so certainly we can just transfer this to a new setting, unfortunately, that really doesn't work because the context actually makes such a huge difference. We need to understand trends. You can't. So on the left, your left is the original PTSD Coach, and on the right is Trauma Recovery Coach, which is newer. You can see that there are some differences. There's no more tabs anymore. We have a hamburger menu, which is also called the lateral menu. There's no more skeuomorphic buttons, which means buttons that look like buttons. They just are flat. All of these trends mean that when your patient or your customer picks up your app, that it's going to feel like it's consistent with the rest of their mobile experience, and it's not some horrific experience that they are trudging through. Anybody who's ever used an electronic health record knows, of any of them, knows how horrible it is to be subject to a bad user experience, even one that you use every single day. I want to give a great example of this, but this is between us. So my husband is a software engineer. At years and years ago, he was, I don't know, senior director or VP or something of mobile engineering at Groupon. And on his resume, it says, he increased the sales at Groupon by X zillions of dollars, whatever. It was like enough to buy a spaceship. And I said to him, because I'm contractually obligated to give him crap, how'd you really, come on, like, how did you really increase sales by that much? And so it turns out when Groupon puts out an app, they're not just A/B testing, they're A, B, C, D, E, F testing. 6 different people will have 6 different versions of the app, and they're constantly testing small differences between them. And it turns out the brilliant thing that Groupon did during his time to make the app sell more stuff, that's the behavior change they're looking for, is more money, is the buy button. They made it like a millimeter bigger. So when you think about that, and not to downplay the importance of my husband's great achievements, think about that for a second. You change the color of a button, you change the size of the button, and you can have a profoundly different effect on people's behaviors. Now, for those of us who are really immersed in theory and think to ourselves that we have the corner on the truth, that we have to do things in this way because this is what the protocol from 1982 says on paper in my binder in my office, we are wrong. We are missing a whole scope of information that comes from our HCI friends, if it's even known at all, and requires a tremendous amount of testing to get to the bottom of why things work or don't work. Choose Parsimony. Solve exactly the problem you need to solve for a specific audience using only the tools that you need to solve it. Prolonged exposure is one of the most effective treatments for PTSD. It's one of 2 that is mostly used in the VA. And what it requires, although this is not in depth, don't go practicing it from this, is that the veteran comes in, they describe the absolute most traumatic, horrific experience that they've ever had. That session is recorded using some sort of digital recorder, and then they take that recorder home and they listen to the experience back every night for homework. And then they come in the next week and they do the same thing again. It's terribly, terribly painful and very effective. So what we found was people were failing at PE therapy because they couldn't because they couldn't get their hands on recorders, because there weren't recorders available at some time. We had to ship them from other parts of the VA, because they had nowhere to listen. So we've got a veteran in Maine sitting in his truck at night listening back to his horrific trauma in the snow. Completely unnecessary when all of them are carrying a recording device and playback device in their pocket, right? So just identifying what are the actual implementation challenges that we're having with doing this therapy so that we can just address those. Now, could we also have wired up the veterans and gotten a whole bunch, we could have gotten spit samples if we wanted to, but it actually just doesn't make sense. We need to start small and build up. Get qualitative input and feedback from every single group of users. When we made PTSD Coach, I was a PTSD expert, but it turns out that I was completely overruled by the 80 veterans who told me what they wanted in an app for PTSD. Now, there were limits on that. Like, for example, what they wanted was a diagnosis from the app, which I can't do legally. And in fact, what they wanted was not even a diagnosis for themselves, but for their friends, so that they could say, I'm the converted. I'm here in a PTSD treatment program. But I know that my friend who came back with me also has PTSD and isn't admitting it. I want my app to tell him to externalize that conversation. And obviously we couldn't do that piece, but take in as much data from your users as possible up front. And that means users, including every group that you will be touching. So if that's clinicians as well. Okay, unintended consequence of graphics and iconography choices. Okay, so this one on the left was the first version of our safety plan app. You may have heard that unfortunately, we have many suicides among veterans and service members. And there's a strategy in the VA for having folks create a safety plan with a suicide prevention coordinator. Our designers proposed this was like the visual design of the app initially, because they wanted it to be cool, meaning cool colors, and not overwhelming, and they wanted it to be simple in case people were really in crisis and needed to use it. Well, it turns out every suicidal person we showed this to interpreted that as a disembodied head and a calculator, and it was absolutely the wrong direction. Blood alcohol calculators. Turns out if you give people with drinking problems blood alcohol calculators, especially with pictures of drinks that look good, it does not stop their drinking behaviors. It just gamifies them. So that's a problem. That one's not my app, by the way. Sorry, whoever was on Google Images. This picture down at the bottom was from the original products that I made with the Department of Defense for people who were recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan. And, you know, we've got like a mixture. I don't know if you can see it that well, but we have a mixture of all of the branches. We have different ranks. We have at least a couple of different races that it's more different if you look closely, which was obviously all planned. But you give this image to service members, and the first thing that they all say is, those aren't the right boots. We got rid of those boots in 2007. And you're just, okay, well, but there's like $100 million website over here. Doesn't matter, not the right boots. They're not interested. Okay, so you have to be careful. Understand clinicians and clinical care. This phone is upside down. This is CBT Coach, which is an app that we built with Rachel Manber at Stanford, but for VA patients, for going through the CBT for insomnia protocol, which is also very effective. And it turns out, because the VA has so many restrictions on sharing data with healthcare providers, we can't share directly, that healthcare providers were complaining because our app didn't work upside down. So the patients are sitting there with them, holding out the app, and they can't actually see what's going on. So it's a very simple fix to make an app work upside down, but it was something that we needed feedback from the field in order to understand. Dashboard fatigue. Don't you dare. If you want to make a research project with a dashboard, totally fine. This is totally acceptable. It is the norm. It is great. Do not bring a dashboard into an actual clinical care setting. Providers have such a limited period of time to interact with each patient. Even providers who have longer windows, like therapists, they can't actually look at a whole bunch of different places. If you can't get things into the electronic health record, you're done. You have to integrate into their existing workflow. You have to consider impacts of the therapeutic alliance. So therapeutic alliance means that 26% of the variance in most types of psychotherapy is due to your alliance with your therapist, which is how much you like them, whether you agree on the tasks and the goals of therapy. Now, part of how much you like them or you have a bond with them is whether you see them as having an expert role. Now, if you have a therapist who doesn't know how to use your Android phone because they're in a socioeconomic group that uses iPhones, then it can be very sort of dysregulating for them that they're now trying to fiddle with the phone with the patient, figure out why the things aren't working, etc. So understanding that. We need to create implementation materials. We need to create clinician guides and all kinds of support. There's a little bit more on that going down. It turns out we've done some studies, and it looks like 45 years old for clinicians is the split. If you are more than 45 years old, you are much more reticent to take on new technologies. I don't know if that's going to just go up each year or if it's going to stay at 45. We'll see. Know your user population. You have to use language, imagery, and everything tested with the actual population that you're going to be using. Creating user profiles, use cases, and workflows is extremely valuable. Here are just two examples of things that I've gotten hilariously wrong. The original version of PTSD Coach, you probably can't see that on the bottom, that tab is labeled assess. That's where your assessments are. Except every single veteran we put it in front of read it as asses. Every single one. I'm not going to, so I can say limited amount about this, but there are antipsychotic companies with antipsychotics, that are putting chips in their pills in order to track adherence and other kinds of biological mechanisms. For psychotic patients, if anybody's ever met a schizophrenic patient, many of them believe that radio waves are being transmitted from inside of their bodies. Now, you are literally transmitting something from inside of their body. It may not be appropriate for the user population that you're talking about. Structure for users, not for your theories or protocols. So this is the original version of PE Coach, super old. But the way that we think about it, because this is the way our binder is that we've got session 1, session 2, session 3. What really we needed to do when we moved to version 2 was to make it so that when the user actually opens the app, what is it that they need to do? Do they remember if they were in session 5 or session 6? No. All they know is, I'm here to do my homework. You need a homework button. And so we've had a lot of big misses where we didn't really think we were doing anything that crazy, but it turns out we were, and unhelpful. Creating good mobile content. No more than 50 to 100 words on a page. You lose 50% of the people at 50 words, and then you're left with just the PhDs after that. You have to use clear titles, edit out any non-essential information. This is what 100 words look like. Sometimes if I have really troubling subject matter experts, I literally give them Word documents with the margins pulled into the size of an iPhone. Initial engagement is the first point of failure. This is Prochaska's model of stages of change. Understanding where your people are. So in the okay, good, perfect. I'm going to be perfect. Understanding where a patient is. So some of the projects in here are like risk prevention. You're identifying a very different person than a person who, for example, is showing up to the VA and saying, I'm uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable for 40 years. If they are in a different moment, you can treat them in a different way. Never underestimate the importance of onboarding. Onboarding is the person's first interaction with your product. Now, you don't have any control over the app stores, maybe, but if you're using a different mechanism for sending products out other than through like traditional marketplaces, understand that onboarding is the #1 predictor of success. Motivational messaging goes with Prochaska's model. Accurate, respectful, and tolerable problem description. If you say to a person who's profoundly depressed, this is for your, I just built an app for postpartum depression. Baby blues is okay, but if you have psychotic major depression following a pregnancy, it turns out that does not resonate with people. It's actually more off-putting and invalidating. Marketing, if you have to do this, which you don't in most academic settings, is often hard for the same reasons you chose to build an app in the first place. Nobody wants to download the holy moly, I am so anxious, I can't even function anymore in society app. And wellness app isn't terribly descriptive. So some of these things are actually about just grabbing people the first time. Assessments. So just like in Cosmo magazine, where they always put the quiz right on the cover, and that is the thing that draws people in. People love talking about themselves. And if you can provide meaningful feedback and insights that say, I see you, I understand what's going on, this is the right tool for you, you have won a big battle. Gamification for sustained engagement is not a panacea. This is Duolingo. Does anybody ever use that app? This is the epitome of design. If you want to know what the best designed app is, Duolingo is it. Go learn a language. You can learn lots of them. It's gamified. It's broken down into bite-sized chunks. Every day I wish I could build Duolingo for mental health, but unfortunately I can't. Game mechanics can help you to keep sustained engagement. So that means telling people when they've progressed, unlocking features, providing rewards to people if they succeed, but you have to consider the appropriateness for your solution. So alternative strategies to gamification, personalization, the more you do, the better. Interactivity, inviting people to actually participate in the thing will be helpful. Responsiveness and value add. So can they get any insight beyond just, a dashboard? Can they get any insight into something new about themselves? Therapeutic alliance. So we can't really replace therapeutic alliance with all digital solutions, but sometimes people use these pedagogical agents. This is the prof from Sleepio. People report great relationships with this guy. They love him. They use the app because of him. So you can create something for people to have a relationship with. And then you can also use the addition of a service layer. This is what VCs are funding the most in Silicon Valley right now, are digital plus service solutions. And that depends if it's like a licensed person or if it's just a coach that's trained by the company. Don't underestimate the challenge of meaning making for users. Oh, this is a paper that I was an author on. But graphs, this is a graph, this is a dashboard. They can be really hard for people to understand, to read and understand. For me, a graph is very helpful because it sort of encapsulates a bunch of ideas into one space, but it's actually really, really complicated. Building mistakes and suggestions, or how I gave up on my years of training and learned to actually build things. Leverage the evidence base wherever possible. This is an app that we built many years ago for smoking cessation, and it just took all of the successful text messages from a smoking cessation text messaging program, and then put them into the content it was already evidence based by itself. Put them into the context of this app, and it turns out this app actually works pretty well. This is Wired magazine from 2008 that said that hypotheses are over. Big data is going to take over. So I apologize, and we can all mourn the death of science that occurred 8 years ago. Decouple content from functions and prioritize interdisciplinary clarity. This is a process that I developed first when I was in the Department of Defense, mobile apps and gaming lead, and then we've used it in VA as well, and then in some startups too. Scope and structure documentation means forget all the stuff that's going to be in the app. Forget the actual assessments. Forget all of the content. Set it aside. Just at a high level, and these are the headings that we tend to use, in plain English, make sure the whole team's on the same page. You have to explain to your designers what a person with schizophrenia actually is like. You have to have a place where you're all on the same page about what you're actually building. Respect your technical colleagues. Understand the difference between a bug and a feature. This is just I don't even know what app this is from, but this is some issues that I found from like recent. Respect your technical colleagues. Understand the difference between a feature and a bug. If your technical colleagues have built a whole thing, don't tell them you don't like the words on the page. That's not nice. Everything we build in the VA has to be accessible by all people with all abilities. You should consider this before you ever put a product out. For a lot of reasons, including that people with disabilities are litigious if you need to make it like about an actual problematic outcome, but also because it's the right thing to do and the tools are available. Anticipate costs. I'm actually just going to skip through to only the important ones to make sure that these ladies have a chance. Don't be greedy, or you'll hear about it either from the user or the IRB. So just gathering every piece of data that you possibly can is going to kill somebody's battery. It's potentially going to kill their data plan, depending on what kind of data it is, and it may annoy them. You can take up too much battery. You can take up too much space on their phone. There's such a thing as notification fatigue. It's real. If your app is not the center of that person's universe, and they may have other things going on too, remember that. Content types have different sizes and demands. So highly dynamic elements are the biggest, like pedagogical agents, that kind of thing, down through video, audio, graphics, and text. So just keep that in mind. Use, but avoid over-reliance on cross-platform solutions. Everyone wants to be able to just build once and then have it work on all devices. It only kind of works still. So keep that in mind, that the responsiveness of your devices actually, and your apps will definitely have an impact on how much people use them. Okay, let me flip forward. You heard a little bit about this already. The problem with research study-based apps is that you have your development in the first phase and then potentially no money or energy for future sustainment. But unfortunately, every September, Apple comes out with a new version of their OS. Android comes out with new OSs on a less regular, but still a pretty consistent basis. So you can be assured that new devices will hit the market and your stuff's going to break. So make sure to build in funding, whether you're in a commercial setting or a research setting, to deal with this. So implementation challenges, these are last. Do dry runs with graduate students or testers. So this is PE Coach again, where the person's recording their session, talking about their trauma. And unfortunately, we forgot that means the veteran's going to be getting text messages during the entirety of their session. that are going off and off and off while they're recording the worst thing that's ever happened to them. So we needed to back up and issue a reminder to providers to have veterans put their phones in airplane mode before they use our app. These are important realities. Oh, this is my office. So that pin is my office. This is Silicon Valley. That's Facebook, sort of right next door-ish. Google, Yahoo, Stanford, etc. So Silicon, very high tech. There's my office again at that start. And then across the street is the frozen yogurt shop where they gave free Wi-Fi, because that's where we need to send our patients and participants to download our apps. If you have realities in clinics, or God knows if you're trying to do things in resource poor populations, you really need to take these kinds of things into consideration. Anticipate support needs. There is nothing more painful that I've ever done than training the VA help desk to identify clinical issues that they should refer out and not try to deal with. Because sometimes my app isn't working, I'm throwing it at the wall, is a clinical issue. So codify that ahead of time. We have apps in the VA now that will do all of your required assessments, but it turns out that the only way that our contractors were putting in the assessment data, not as structured data into this is Vista, our health record, but as a progress note, which means that it's not flagging anybody. It's just in there. Maybe your next appointment at the VA is your dentist appointment, and your dentist is maybe seeing that you were suicidal last night, or maybe not. So there are real significant dangers there. So that's it for me. I hope that was very practical for you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me. My personal email address is better than my VA one because it comes to my phone, which is where I live. And thank you very much.